Clear Channel for probably about an hour.
Yes.
What didn't they ask you? What were you waiting for that they forgot to ask?
Well, I don't think there was anything because there was so much to talk about, and that we covered just a little bit. So the field is wide open.
As you put this book together, inspired probably to convey your message to your grandchildren.
Yes.
Were they asking lots of questions of you?
They were, but because they're so young, they didn't have a lot of questions. But as they grow, those questions have really multiplied. In fact, they have now a burgeoning library of materials written especially for kids that age about the Little Rock episode. So when you go into their home, this, my wife calls it a shrine. It's not really. But they have an area there for books that have to do with Little Rock.
Were your kids interested? Normally it's the grandchildren who start to...
No, my kids were very interested.
Were they?
In fact, as kids, they used to crawl around and they would put on the medals that I had garnered and play with those. And a lot of their play was about being a civil rights hero.
Right.
And that's amazing. I didn't realize how much they had absorbed until I saw them at play.
No kidding.
Yeah.
You're born in 1940, so you were 14 years old when Brown...
41.
41, okay.
41. I was 13 when Brown passed, and then 15 when we started the school desegregation in 1957.
I'm from the Robert Jackson Center. Justice Jackson was one of the 9 members on the Brown versus Board Supreme Court.
Right.
And intimately involved in sort of the backroom politics to get unanimity. When that came down in your neighborhood, was that a conversation among your community members?
Oh, very definitely so. Very definitely so. There was a great deal of expectation and hope expressed because now, and it had been centuries before such a thing had happened, well, I think such a thing had never happened, but the law was now on our side.
Right.
The law had said it is no longer constitutional to discriminate. That was revelation.
Was there celebration, or was it just sort of a next chapter?
A muted celebration, and I think that sense of hopefulness pervaded the community where I lived.
Right.
From the person who lived on the street to the person who was an accomplished professional, I think there was this tie that bound them together, that we as a people will now have a chance, whereas before, the law said you really don't have a chance.
So really, this was another example of using a cause within the legal system. I mean, there is a Supreme Court decision followed up by Brown versus Board 2.
Yes.
With all deliberate speed. And as I read it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Arkansas Board of Education sort of adopt a plan?
They did, early on.
Yeah.
Once the 54 decision was made, they began to think about how it might be implemented in Little Rock. It took them a few years to get it all done, but interestingly enough, I think it was a instance of the board members of that time. Here were a cadre of people who thought significantly different from most of their peers, and they happened to come together. There was this confluence of like-minded people who got the ball rolling. Now, unfortunately, once their decision was made public, they lost favor. And as a consequence, they literally fell apart. But they couldn't take it back at that point.
So the plan is in place to integrate, but enter the political process.
Yes. And now the politicos get involved, especially the governor. Ha! He was quite a fellow. And you know, interestingly enough, Orville Faubus, the governor, was not originally an avowed segregationist, but he saw the handwriting on the wall. If he were to be governor of Arkansas and maintain that position, he not only had to be segregationist, he had to be one of the more extreme segregationists. And so he became that.
So you, as a group, did your parents all kind of get together and sign petitions and to decide to go to that white school? Because I knew that was the option, wasn't it?
No, none of that, none of that. Our parents didn't even know about it in the beginning.
Oh, really?
The school board sent members or representatives to the all-black schools, Horace Mann High, Dunbar Middle School, there were just 2. They talked about this plan. September 57, Central High School will be desegregated. Well, we need students. How many of you are willing to join? we all, not all, but significant numbers of us, probably 150 or at least, raised hands. But the numbers came down very quickly once we got home and explained to our parents what we had done, because many parents were not too pleased and were fearful, and rightly so when you think about it, because the rumors of violence started immediately. And the word on the street was that there will be black blood flowing in the gutters of Little Rock if this thing happens. So most of the parents said no. But the parents of the 9 of us were willing. And how they arrived at that decision is still a mystery to all of us, because none of them really spoke about it directly. None of them.
So independent decision making, saying it's okay, Terrence, we'll support you.
Those were the very words. We will support you 100%. Amazing. Although I had my argument all prepared, I didn't have to use it.
Now, what turned out was, I guess originally was the Little Rock 10 winter.
Yes,
10.
yes. And Jane Hill, whose face shows up in the archives, was there on the first day. Her dad received a phone call saying, look, if you send Jane to Central tomorrow, don't bother coming to work anymore. And he was afraid, so he pulled her out. But the upshot of all of that was he lost his job anyway, since he'd had the temerity to think he could send her. And you know, in retrospect, when you think about it, he probably could have figured that out had he been paying attention.
Now, day one, when you are going to enter the school, did you meet off campus collectively?
We did.
Yeah.
Well, not the very first day. The very first day, Elizabeth came by herself. I came shortly afterwards by myself. And then a group of 7 students, including Jane, came with a group of ministers. They came en masse. So that's a total of 9, but that's not the original Little Rock 9, because one of that group was not there. And that was Melba Beals. Melba wasn't there on that first day. But then, once Jane's father pulled her out, our numbers remained at 9, with Melba now reinstituted.
After that first day's experience, which wasn't was it successful? I mean, in the sense that you walked in individually by yourself. There's that iconic picture dealing with Miss Eckford.
Right, right. Well, no, we never got close to the school that day.
Yeah.
There was no way, because the National Guard was there. We couldn't even get on the grounds. We all had to go home. It took probably 3 weeks for us to get into school, and only then, because the Army was now in place. The National Guard was gone, and the Army was there. The 101st Airborne escorted us to class. And they remained for probably 5 to 6 weeks. And here's a twist. At the end of their time there, they were replaced by the now newly federalized Arkansas State National Guard. So the same guys who kept us out now have the charge of protecting us now that we're in.
Did their attitudes change, or?
Hard to say, and you'll find some difference of opinion from the 9 of us. My own estimate is they were good. They protected us. And I think, in my case, now some of the 9 will say, we got hit more than we needed to because they intervened slowly. I don't know that that's true. But for me, I would often run, so I didn't catch many blows anyway.
Yeah. How was your psyche? You were really challenged. Intellectually, physically, psychologically challenged.
I had an ongoing relationship with fear, for one thing.
Yep.
I'd never been that afraid in my life. I mean, I went to school fearful, and I remained fearful all day. I went home with fear. But after a time, I figured out that if I'm going to survive this thing, I'd better make some real acquaintanceship with fear. So I began a process of owning it. So once I owned the fear, it dissipated a little bit. I was able to go where I wanted to go with the fear, so I developed a mantra: fear will not interfere with goal-directed behavior. That worked.
Was there lifelines in the sense of a support structure within the school, or even outside? Well,
outside certainly, because we had lots of support from people who were well-wishers at the very least, But then those people who promised to pray hard for us, and then those people who offered tangible support in terms of giving us rides when we needed it, or just pep talks when we needed it. Within the school, there was some, not a lot, because within the school, the social pressure was so great on the administrators, the teachers, and the students to stay away from us. And if they got too close to us, they were branded nigger lovers, and they caught as much hell as we did. You know?
I mean, Brown versus Board was the termination of separate but equal. Here you were in an equal school environment, but did you feel separate?
Well, you know, the old doctrine of separate but equal was erroneous because it was always separate, and therein lies the problem. Always separate but never equal. And so once we got to Central, there was no question that we were not going to be considered equal. No way on earth. I mean, it was a forced issue as far as the school was concerned. Most of the people there didn't want to do it. They said, look, I know the law has changed, but we don't support that. We would prefer business as usual, and we want you to know that too. This was all not spoken directly, of course. But
Governor Faubus, when you would come home after school and you turn on the television and there on the black and white screen was Governor Faubus rallying the troops. What were you thinking?
Well, I always saw him as a rather tragic figure because he had sort of cast his lot with the segregationists, and I didn't think they were going to win this fight.
Yeah.
I thought that's a losing battle. In fact, I got to meet him years later. The two of us were invited to appear on Good Morning America. So we did. We show up there. And backstage, I confronted him. I said, Governor, your actions were such that we could have all been killed. What were you thinking? He said, well, you know, I had to do that. Otherwise, I would not have been reelected. So that was his whole ploy. That was his position. He was, quote, forced to do things to maintain his public office. And I said to him, you know, you had an opportunity to leave quite a different legacy, and I think you would have been more proud of it. He didn't buy it. He repeated that same nonsense later on. We did a video oral history project over at the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, Kansas. Almost the same verbiage.
So there wasn't, like George Wallace at some point actually had a little soulful reconciliation.
Yeah, George woke up.
Yeah.
I don't know how deeply rooted that was, but he did know how to count votes.
That's right. Are you surprised today that the recognition you've gotten for those actions, taking it?
You know, honestly, yes, because there were so many other things that went on in addition to Little Rock. Some of them much more violent, some of them where people lost lives and so forth. But Little Rock seems to capture the imagination in a different way, and I'm not quite sure why. But Minnie Jean, one of our group, says it's because there were so many elements in the story. That's Little Rock talks about state versus federal government in terms of power and control. It speaks about long-standing ways of living being challenged. It involves kids, it involves parents, it involves people on both sides of that equation, those supportive and those not supportive. And all of those things, I think, gets enough people involved as a group. So the group widens the more things are focused on in that episode.
1957 was the pivotal year for you, your group. 1958, Faubus closes all the schools down.
Yes, that's another chapter in this whole madness.
I mean,
every single public high school in Little Rock was now closed, and stayed closed for the entire year. Although that was not the most egregious example of that kind of a behavior. The schools in Prince Edward County, Virginia, for instance, were closed for 4 years consecutively, and not just high schools. Elementary, middle schools, and high schools all closed for 4 years. And you think about the devastation for a community. In Little Rock, it was bad enough because a number of kids dropped out and never got back into school. That was the end of formal education for them. Now, I had an out. I had relatives in California, so I simply moved to LA and graduated from LA High. 5 of us of the 9 were juniors. All of us went someplace else to graduate. So we found outlets. But this was not true for the majority of students, black or white, in Little Rock. And when you interview people who went through that, there's still a great deal of bitterness. In fact, I was hired by the Little Rock School District as a desegregation consultant in 1998, and I worked there for 4 years. But during that tenure, I met a woman who had been at Central when we were there, white woman, and she approached me one day with anger, and she said it was because of you that I had no prom. The prom was canceled in 1958. And you know, I felt badly for her, because I reasoned that here's a young woman, think about it, she saved up her money to buy this prom dress, she's persuaded some guy to take her, and now there's nothing. I didn't say any of that to her, of course, but I thought that.
Yeah. Well, you know, because I assume there was a tremendous backlash in 58, probably as great as 57, because now the whites are really directly impacted. They got no school.
Right, right.
And they got to be blaming the blacks, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Not all of us, the blacks.
Exactly. That's how it works.
Yeah. So you went off to California. Did you come back then to Little Rock at some point, or were you?
Not to live. I've been back to Little Rock on occasion, and that 4-year consultantship kept me there every month for at least a week. But then I go back even now to do workshops at the museum. There's this historical museum right near Central High School. In fact, the high school itself is a national park site. So there are all kinds of programs that go on there. But I persuaded my entire family to move to Los Angeles in 1958. So we all left Little Rock almost at the same time.
Among now I know there's, what, 7 of you that are alive?
8 alive.
Do you get together?
All the time. We have our foundation, Little Rock 9 Foundation, and that's accessible on the web at www.littlerock9.com, and we appreciate all contributions.
Sure.
So we give scholarships to kids who need to go to college but don't have enough money, and we are international, and we don't discriminate. Anybody's eligible.
What's the legacy of the whole Little Rock? When you could ask that question, what's...
Well, I think for me, it's worth saying that Little Rock proved that if your focus is keen and you have goals you want to accomplish, then you can do it in spite of the opposition, no matter how strenuous that opposition might be.
Right. So as you're here today, you got your book. You'll be, I think, speaking later on. You'll be on a panel.
Right.
Is that the message to these teaching teachers?
Well, what we're going to stress with them is a number of things, not the least of which is to point out the life of Judge Ronald Davies, who was the federal judge who ruled in the Little Rock case in 1957. He's from Fargo, North Dakota. And the reason he got involved from that distance is that none of the southern judges were willing to touch the case.
Right.
His perseverance, his courage in the face of great opposition is another part of the Little Rock story, because he exemplified what's possible, even though maybe the entire nation, if we were to say it that way, were headed in one direction, he was willing to go in another, which gives him an authority that speaks to all the people who feel oppressed, wherever they are, knowing that it can be done.
This is all part of the court system and the rule of law. Ultimately, didn't this decision by the district court judge, it found its way up to the Supreme Court, didn't it? Did this one?
Well, in a sense, because there was another Supreme Court decision that had to do with getting those schools open again, Cooper versus Aaron.
That's it, yeah.
And that case, of course, yeah, that was part of that.
So, incredible history. You're incredible history.
Well, thank you.
I'm just
thank
so
you.
thrilled you took time. I know people want to talk to you, but thank you on behalf of the Robert Jackson Center and stuff, and we look forward to the time we get you there.
Well, thank you very much, indeed.
We got your card, and we'll be in touch.
Okay, doke.
Thank you, Terrence.
Oh, cool, Greg. I like it.
Great.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't even know about the Jackson Center, but I will check it out.